In Vietnam, silence didn't mean safety. It meant someone was already watching. Australia didn't fight this war with overwhelming force. There were no massive formations, no endless firepower, just small groups of men moving slowly through jungle where every step could trigger an ambush. They fought battles that never made headlines, operations built on bad intelligence, moments where a single mistake meant no one made it out. This wasn't the American war the world remembers. This was Australia's war, fought in isolation, outnumbered, and far from home. If you value in-depth military history that doesn't shy away from the hard truths, support this documentary by leaving a like. It helps more than you think. And let us know in the comments which forgotten battle or operation should be covered next. This is the Forgotten Front. This is Australia in Vietnam. In the thick jungles of South Vietnam, June 1971, a routine Australian patrol stumbled into something far greater than they ever expected. What began as cautious footsteps through the trees turned into one of the last great battles fought by Australian forces in the Vietnam War. A desperate clash of courage, firepower, and survival known as the Battle of Long Con. By this point, the war was already shifting. America was pulling its men back under Vietnamization. Australia, too, was winding down, preparing to bring soldiers home. Yet the enemy wasn't fading away. Hidden in the dense jungle of Long Con province, the North Vietnamese army had built a fortified stronghold. And when 3 RAR, the 3rd Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment, crossed their path, they were about to face an ambush that would test their grit to the absolute limit. Over 2 days in close quarters and under constant fire, a small Australian force fought against a determined enemy who refused to give ground. It was brutal. It was costly. And it became a forgotten chapter of the war, overshadowed by Long Tan and Coral, but no less important in the story of Australia's role in Vietnam. Before we dive into this incredible story, I want to share our own mission. Right now, more than 90% of you watching aren't subscribed. Our goal is to reach 15,000 subscribers, and with your support, we can get there. If you love forgotten history, untold battles, and stories of courage, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now let's step into the jungle of Long Con, June 1971. By mid-1971, the Vietnam War was changing. The United States, once committed to fighting with hundreds of thousands of troops, was now pulling men out in waves. Washington called it Vietnamization, the plan to hand over more responsibility to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, while American soldiers went home. Australia, a key ally since the early years of the conflict, was following the same path. At its peak, more than 7,000 Australians served in Vietnam, but by 1971, that number had been cut down dramatically. The 1st Australian Task Force, 1 ATF, once a powerful formation with multiple battalions, armor, and artillery, was now reduced to just a fraction of its former size. Only 2 battalions remained in the field, stretched thin across a wide area. This downsizing created new challenges. Fewer men meant fewer patrols, less coverage, and greater risk whenever soldiers ventured into hostile territory. Yet the enemy showed no signs of giving up. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and their Viet Cong allies remained deeply entrenched in the countryside. Their networks of bunkers, tunnels, and hidden camps allowed them to strike and then vanish into the jungle. They had already proven at battles like Long Tan and Coral that they could go toe-to-toe with conventional forces. Long Con Province, northeast of Saigon, became one of those battlegrounds. It was a critical region, not only close to the capital, but also filled with infiltration routes, supply trails, and jungle base areas. Intelligence suggested that the 3rd 33rd NVA Regiment was active there, preparing for operations. To disrupt them, the Australians of 3 RAR were ordered into the area to conduct sweeps and clear enemy positions. What they didn't realize was that deep in the jungle, hidden beneath dense canopy and camouflaged earthworks, the enemy had constructed a heavily fortified base. The Australians were about to walk straight into it and trigger a clash that would stand as one of their last major battles of the war. At the center of the Battle of Long Con was the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 3 RAR. These were professional soldiers, many of them seasoned by earlier operations in Phuoc Tuy and beyond. By June 1971, they were battle-hardened, but operating under tough conditions. Fewer numbers, long patrols, and the constant uncertainty of an enemy who knew the jungle better than anyone. A typical Australian rifle company at the time was made up of small, flexible units built for jungle warfare. The backbone was the section, 10 men commanded by a corporal, armed with the M16 rifle or the 7.62 mm SLR, supported by a machine gunner with the M60. Sections moved lightly, relying on stealth, communication, and discipline to avoid ambushes. Supporting 3 RAR were armored vehicles from the 3rd Cavalry Regiment, equipped with M113 Armored Personnel Carriers APCS. These were more than just transport. With mounted heavy machine guns, they provided mobile firepower and protection in terrain where tanks couldn't operate. Artillery was another crucial part of the Australian order of battle. 105 mm howitzers from the artillery batteries were positioned to deliver rapid fire support whenever troops made contact. In Vietnam, artillery was often the difference between survival and disaster, and commanders relied on it heavily when facing hidden enemy bunkers. Overhead, the Australians could count on helicopter support, not only for supply and medical evacuation, but also gunships armed with rockets and machine guns. These aircraft gave 3 RAR a lifeline in the dense jungle, where movement on foot was slow and dangerous. Together, this mix of infantry, armor, artillery, and air support gave 3 RAR a powerful punch. But in the jungles of Long Con, numbers mattered, and the enemy they were about to face had the advantage of both preparation and position. On the other side of the battlefield stood the North Vietnamese Army's 3rd 33rd Regiment, backed by local Viet Cong fighters. By 1971, the NVA was no longer just a guerrilla force. They had become a highly disciplined, well-trained army, capable of conventional combat when the terrain and conditions favored them. Their strength lay in preparation. Deep in the jungles of Long Con province, they had built an extensive fortified bunker system. These weren't just holes in the ground. They were carefully engineered fighting positions, reinforced with logs, earth, and camouflage that made them almost invisible from above. Each bunker connected with others, creating a network that allowed them to resist artillery and airstrikes, then pop up to fire back with deadly precision. The weapons they carried were simple but effective. The standard rifle was the AK-47, reliable in the mud and rain of Vietnam. For heavier firepower, they relied on RPG-2 and RPG-7 rocket launchers, perfect for blasting at Australian APCS, or fortified positions. They also carried RPD light machine guns, mortars, and grenades, giving them flexible ways to hit hard and then melt back into cover. What made the NVA especially dangerous was their fighting philosophy. Unlike the Australians, who were thousands of miles from home, these soldiers were defending ground they had lived and fought on for years. They knew the jungle intimately, using its cover to stage ambushes, lay traps, and retreat along hidden tracks whenever the battle turned against them. In Long Con, the 3rd 33rd Regiment wasn't looking for a skirmish. They were entrenched in their stronghold, ready to bleed any force that came too close. For the Australians of 3 RAR, stumbling into that fortress would mean a sudden, violent clash with a determined enemy who had every advantage of terrain and preparation. In early June 1971, the men of 3 RAR were tasked with clearing parts of Long Con province. The orders were straightforward: conduct search and destroy patrols to locate enemy bases and disrupt NVA activity in the region. For the Australians, this was familiar work. Long days of moving silently through dense undergrowth, watching for tripwires and listening for the faintest sounds of movement in the bush. But almost immediately there were signs that the enemy was close. Scouts discovered fresh tracks, abandoned cooking fires, and the outlines of hidden trails winding deeper into the forest. Intelligence suggested the presence of elements from the 3rd 33rd NVA Regiment, but no one knew exactly how large their force was or how heavily they were dug in. The Australians pressed on, sections fanned out, carefully sweeping through areas known for bunker complexes. Every step was tense. One false move could mean a sudden burst of gunfire or the crack of an RPG. On the morning of the 6th of June, a patrol pushed deeper into the jungle. At first it seemed quiet, Too quiet. The thick canopy muffled every sound, and visibility was reduced to only a few meters. Then came the discovery that changed everything. A concealed bunker system far larger than expected. What looked like a small enemy hideout was in fact a fortified base area. Camouflaged firing ports peered out from earthen walls. Trenches and communication tunnels crisscrossed the site. Before the Australians could pull back, the jungle erupted with automatic fire, RPGs, and mortars. In that instant, 3RAR realized they had not stumbled across a stray patrol. They had walked straight into the defenses of an entrenched NVA regiment, and the Battle of Long Khan had begun. At dawn on the 6th of June 1971, the men of 3RAR advanced cautiously through the dense jungle of Long Khan province. Visibility was poor. The heavy canopy above dimmed the light, while thick undergrowth limited movement to slow, deliberate steps. Every man knew that the North Vietnamese army was out there. The question was where and how strong. The answer came suddenly. As a forward patrol reached the edge of a clearing, the silence shattered with the sharp crack of AK-47 fire. Bullets ripped through the foliage, splintering branches and snapping leaves. Almost immediately, the deep thump of RPGs and the whistle of mortars followed. The Australians had walked into a storm. Caught off guard, the patrol dropped into defensive positions, firing back with M16, SLRS, and M60 machine guns. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere, concealed in bunkers, firing from camouflaged trenches, disappearing back into tunnels before anyone could pin them down. The Australians quickly realized this was no small contact. They were facing a fortified base area defended by a determined NVA force. Radios crackled as calls went out for artillery support. Within minutes, 105mm shells began raining down, the blasts echoing through the jungle, shaking the earth and shredding trees. Still, the NVA held on. Their bunkers absorbed much of the punishment, and their troops fired back with discipline, forcing the Australians to keep their heads down. Casualties mounted. Several men were wounded in the first exchange, and medics scrambled under fire to drag them to safety. Dust-off helicopters circled, waiting for a chance to swoop in through the smoke and trees. To prevent being overrun, the Australians began pulling back slightly, creating a perimeter while fire support hammered the enemy positions. The jungle turned into a cauldron of noise, small arms fire snapping constantly, the roar of artillery, the thunder of airstrikes strafing the bunker line. Yet even with this firepower, the enemy refused to break. Every time an Australian section moved forward, gunfire erupted from hidden positions. The NVA had spent months preparing these defenses, and they intended to make the attackers pay for every step. As night closed in, the battle showed no signs of ending. The Australians had held their ground, but the scale of the enemy position was still unclear. What was certain was that 3RAR had stumbled into something far bigger than a routine patrol. The fight for Long Khan had only just begun. As the battle raged on through the 6th of June, it became clear to the Australian commanders that this was no minor contact. 3RAR had stumbled upon a major North Vietnamese bunker system, and the fight was quickly escalating into one of the fiercest clashes of their deployment. Reinforcements were called in. From nearby fire bases, artillery units increased their fire missions, blanketing the enemy position with a relentless barrage of 105mm shells. Each detonation tore through the jungle, collapsing trees and sending plumes of dirt and smoke into the air. Yet even under this pounding, the NVA bunkers held firm. The earthworks, reinforced with timber and hidden under dense foliage, soaked up much of the destruction. Soon after, armored support from the 3rd Cavalry Regiment thundered onto the scene. M113 Armored Personnel Carriers, APCs, pushed through the jungle, their mounted heavy machine guns spitting fire into enemy positions. The roar of their engines and the chatter of 50-caliber rounds gave the infantry much-needed breathing space. Overhead, airstrikes screamed down, dropping bombs and rockets into suspected bunker lines. The jungle shook with every strike, a rolling wave of destruction aimed at breaking the NVA's defenses. But still, the enemy refused to yield. Well-trained and deeply dug in, the North Vietnamese soldiers fought back with discipline and ferocity. RPGs streaked through the trees, slamming into the ground near the APCS. Mortars rained down on Australian positions, keeping the infantry pinned and casualties mounting. The Australians pressed forward cautiously, trading ground for firepower. Each bunker had to be blasted with artillery or explosives before troops could move in. Every step forward carried the risk of another ambush. By the end of the first day, 3 RAR had managed to hold their ground and inflict heavy damage. But the enemy was far from broken. The Australians knew the fight wasn't over. The next day would bring a renewed assault to clear the bunker system once and for all. As dawn broke on the 7th of June 1971, the Australians of 3 RAR prepared for another day in the jungle of Long Khan. The previous day's contact had proven that the enemy was entrenched, disciplined, and determined to fight. Now, reinforced with armor, artillery, and air support, the Australians were ready to push harder. The plan was simple but dangerous. Combine infantry, APCS, artillery, and airstrikes into a coordinated assault to dismantle the bunker complex. At first light, artillery batteries opened up, pounding the jungle with a rolling barrage. The thunder of explosions echoed for miles, intended to soften the defenses before the infantry moved in. Then came the push. Companies from 3 RAR advanced cautiously behind the bombardment, supported by M113 APCS, whose heavy machine guns swept the tree line. The thick jungle slowed progress, forcing troops to advance bunker by bunker, clearing each one with grenades and small arms fire. The North Vietnamese resisted fiercely. Bursts of AK-47 fire and RPGs erupted from hidden firing points, striking dangerously close to the advancing Australians. Every step forward meant exposure to unseen gunmen. Casualties continued to mount, and medics worked frantically under fire to keep men alive. Overhead, air support unleashed another round of strikes. Jets screamed in low, dropping bombs into the thick canopy, while helicopter gunships sprayed rockets and machine gun fire to suppress enemy movement. The combined firepower began to tip the balance. By midday, the pressure was too much for the NVA. Under the weight of constant bombardment and advancing infantry, they began to withdraw from the bunker system. The Australians pushed in, discovering abandoned fighting positions, destroyed equipment, and the bodies of enemy soldiers. Large caches of weapons, supplies, and documents were captured, confirming the scale of the base. By the afternoon, the immediate threat was over. The 3rd 33rd NVA Regiment had slipped away into the jungle, leaving their stronghold behind. The Australians had fought their way through one of the toughest battles of their final year in Vietnam, but the cost had been high. When the guns finally fell silent on the afternoon of the 7th of June 1971, the battlefield told a brutal story. For the Australians of 3 RAR, the fight had been costly. 6 men were killed in action, and another 19 were wounded during the 2 days of combat. Medics and helicopter crews had risked everything to evacuate the injured under fire, and the survivors carried scars, both physical and mental, that would stay with them long after Vietnam. The enemy losses were heavier. Australian patrols counted at least 50 North Vietnamese soldiers dead, with many more believed wounded or carried away by their comrades during the retreat. Captured caches revealed not only rifles and machine guns, but also mortars, ARPGs, and documents that confirmed the scale of the bunker system. In tactical terms, the battle was an Australian victory. The enemy base was shattered, its defenses smashed by artillery and airstrikes, its stores destroyed or seized. The 3rd 33rd NVA Regiment had been forced to withdraw, leaving their stronghold behind. Yet, like so many battles in Vietnam, the victory was temporary. The enemy would regroup elsewhere, and the jungle would quickly swallow the scars of the fight. For the men of 3 RAR, however, Long Khan was etched forever in memory, a sharp, costly clash in the final year of Australia's combat role in Vietnam. The Battle of Long Khan ended with the Australians in control of the field, but its meaning stretched far beyond the jungle that had been fought over. In the short term, the results were clear. The 333rd NVA Regiment had been driven from its fortified base, its supply caches destroyed, and its operations disrupted. For weeks afterward, enemy activity in the province slowed, showing that the battle had dealt a serious blow to their plans. For the Australians, however, the fight carried a heavier weight. By mid-1971, The government in Canberra had already announced the drawdown of combat troops. The 1st Australian Task Force, once a multi-battalion formation, was now shrinking. Every operation carried the knowledge that it might be one of the last. Long Con, in fact, became one of the final major engagements fought by Australian ground forces in Vietnam. The battle highlighted both the strengths and limitations of the Australian approach to the war. On the one hand, the disciplined infantry tactics, combined with armor, artillery, and air support, had once again proven capable of defeating a determined enemy in difficult terrain. The professionalism of 3RAR under fire was unquestionable. On the other hand, Long Con showed the enduring challenge of the Vietnam War. Even when base areas were destroyed and heavy casualties inflicted, the enemy often slipped away to fight another day. Tactical victories rarely translated into lasting strategic change. Politically, the clash reinforced the sense in Australia that it was time to step back. The war had become deeply unpopular at home, and battles like Long Con, costly, bloody, and fought just as the end of the commitment loomed, drove home the question of what was being achieved by staying longer. For the men who fought there, Long Con was more than just another jungle battle. It was a final test of endurance and courage, fought at the tail end of a long and controversial war. Though overshadowed by the famous stands at Long Tan and Coral Balmoral, it remains a key piece of Australia's military history. Proof that even in withdrawal, the soldiers of 3RAR fought with determination and skill. The Battle of Long Con never achieved the fame of Long Tan, 1966, or Coral Balmoral, 1968. It was fought late in the war, at a time when public attention in Australia had turned against the conflict and when the government was already pulling troops home. For many, it became just another entry in the long list of Vietnam war clashes. Yet for the men of 3RAR, Long Con was unforgettable. It stood as one of the last times Australian soldiers fought a pitched battle against a determined enemy. The bravery of small patrols suddenly pinned down, the grit of infantry pressing forward bunker by bunker, and the sacrifice of those who didn't return. These are etched into the memories of veterans who carried the story home. In military history, the battle is often cited as proof of Australia's professionalism in jungle warfare. Even with reduced numbers, stretched supply lines, and the looming reality of withdrawal, the soldiers of 3RAR showed they could match and overcome an entrenched North Vietnamese regiment. The legacy of Long Con is twofold. Tactically, it was a victory that showcased skill, coordination, and courage. Symbolically, it marked the closing chapter of Australia's combat role in Vietnam. Though it remains in the shadow of earlier battles, Long Con deserves recognition as one of the final tests faced by Australian forces. A hard, costly reminder of the price paid in a war that was drawing to an end. The Battle of Long Con may not be carved into the collective memory like Long Tan, but for those who fought it, it was every bit as real, as brutal, and as defining. In June 1971, with Australia already preparing to withdraw, the men of 3RAR found themselves in a fight that tested everything they had: discipline, firepower, and sheer determination. Over 2 days against an enemy hidden in fortified bunkers and fighting with ferocity, they stood their ground, adapted, and prevailed. The cost was heavy: 6 Australians killed, 19 wounded. But the outcome was a reminder of what these soldiers were capable of, even as their country's role in the war drew to a close. Long Con stands as one of the last great battles fought by Australian troops in Vietnam. It was a final demonstration of courage and professionalism in a war that left deep scars at home and abroad. If you've made it this far, you can help us on our mission. More than 90% of viewers aren't subscribed, and we're pushing hard to reach 15,000 subscribers. If you want more forgotten battles, hidden history, and stories of courage, hit that subscribe button and join us. Together, we'll keep these stories alive. The sun was blinding, the air was thick with humidity, and somewhere, just beyond the wall of jungle, the enemy was waiting. On February 17, 1967, Australian soldiers were dropped into the coastal flatlands of Phuoc Tuy province for what was supposed to be a swift, punishing strike against a retreating Viet Cong force. Intelligence suggested the enemy was on the run. The mission was simple: cut them off, corner them, and wipe them out. But the Viet Cong weren't running. They were dug in. What followed was one of the most brutal single-day battles Australian troops would fight during the entire Vietnam War. A chaotic, close-quarters engagement that left armored vehicles burning in the sand, soldiers pinned down in chest-deep swamp water, and medics dragging the wounded out under fire. Operation Bribie was a lesson written in blood. The Australian forces were well-trained, well-armed, and backed by air and artillery support. But none of it mattered when the jungle swallowed them whole, and the enemy sprang their trap with ruthless precision. 8 Australians were killed, more than 20 were wounded, and questions about what went wrong would haunt commanders for years to come. This is the story of Operation Bribie, the battle that shattered illusions, changed tactics, and reminded everyone that in Vietnam, no operation ever goes as planned. By early 1967, the Vietnam War was escalating fast. Australia had committed thousands of troops to the conflict, joining its American ally in the fight against communist expansion. The first Australian task force, 1ATF, was based in Phuoc Tuy province, southeast of Saigon, a hotbed of Viet Cong activity. Australian commanders were focused on counterinsurgency, long patrols, intelligence gathering, and hitting guerrilla units before they disappeared into the jungle. But just after the Tet Lunar New Year truce, reports came in. A large Viet Cong force had been spotted regrouping near the village of Ap My An, not far from the coast. It appeared to be the enemy's 274th Regiment, part of the same force responsible for ambushes and attacks against ARVN and Allied troops in the region. Command saw an opportunity, catch the Viet Cong before they slipped away. The plan was to launch a rapid, overwhelming strike. Infantry would be flown in by helicopter, while armored vehicles moved in by road. Artillery and air support would be on standby. The objective was clear: trap and destroy. There was confidence in the air. After months of patrolling and minor clashes, this was the kind of bold action that promised results. But Vietnam didn't reward boldness, it punished assumptions. And at Bribie, the cost would be high. If you're enjoying this breakdown of Australia's forgotten battles in Vietnam, take a second to hit like and subscribe. Over 90% of our viewers aren't subscribed yet, and it helps more people discover stories like this. The ones history forgot, but soldiers never did. Back in Phuoc Tuy, helicopters began spinning up. Troops loaded in, unaware that the operation they were about to launch would leave vehicles burning, wounded dragged through swamps, and a brutal ambush carved into the memory of every man who survived. The helicopters came in low over the treetops, kicking up dirt, smoke, and swirls of dead grass as they dropped into the landing zone. Just after noon on February 17, 1967, B Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 6th RAR, was inserted into the sandy coastal plains near Ap My An, a small hamlet along the Long Hai Peninsula, just north of the Courtenay rubber plantation. The terrain looked open and manageable: sand dunes, patches of low scrub, and cane fields stretching toward thicker jungle. It seemed ideal for maneuvering troops and vehicles. But appearances in Vietnam were always deceiving. The soldiers quickly fanned out, weapons up, eyes scanning the tree line. Their mission was to engage and destroy a reported Viet Cong force believed to be retreating inland from the coast. What they didn't know was that the enemy wasn't running at all. They were waiting, hidden in cleverly prepared bunkers that blended perfectly into the dense foliage. At first, there was only silence. Then a few signs: trampled brush, fresh footprints, the lingering smell of cigarette smoke in the air. The kind of details soldiers learn to notice when death is nearby. Then the radio crackled. Enemy contact. Within moments, automatic fire erupted from the tree line ahead. Bravo Company had walked into the kill zone. Viet Cong machine guns opened up in synchronized bursts, pinning the lead elements to the ground. A K-47 fire cracked through the air. RPGs slammed into nearby trees and sand. Several Australians were hit within the first minutes. The terrain offered little protection. What looked open from the air was actually a maze of shallow swamps, tangled scrub, and hard, dry sand that made it nearly impossible to dig in. Every movement exposed the soldiers further. As Bravo Company returned fire and tried to reposition, it became clear the enemy was not only prepared, They were dug in with deliberate kill zones. And more concerning still, they weren't pulling back. They were holding their ground, with enough strength to challenge an entire Australian company head-on. The mission had shifted. This was no longer a quick search and destroy operation. This was a battle. And the Australians were now fighting for every inch of ground. Bravo Company was pinned. Fire came from the front, both flanks, and even from behind. The Viet Cong had laid out their ambush with ruthless precision, using interlocking arcs of fire from concealed bunkers and spider holes. Every movement drew fresh bursts of gunfire. What had started as a quick search mission had become a desperate fight to survive. The Australians responded fast. Platoon commanders shouted orders over the roar of gunfire, trying to establish a firing line and return accurate fire. Soldiers crawled through the sand, seeking whatever cover they could find, behind logs in shallow depressions, next to burning vegetation. Every inch of movement was met with incoming fire. The enemy wasn't just reacting, they were prepared for this exact fight. Radio operators called in for artillery support. Within minutes, 105mm howitzers from Nui Dat began raining down shells onto enemy positions. Danger close. The jungle shook as explosions ripped through the trees, but the enemy was dug in deep. Bunkers made of timber and earth absorbed the blasts, and when the shelling paused, the gunfire resumed just as fierce. By early afternoon, Alpha Company was ordered in to reinforce Bravo and flank the enemy positions. They were met with the same resistance: well-sighted machine guns, snipers in trees, and carefully placed RPG teams. Several armored personnel carriers, APCs from C Squadron, 3rd Cavalry Regiment joined the fight, rolling into the thick of the battle with their M113s, guns blazing. But even armor wasn't safe. One APC was hit by RPG fire and burst into flames, killing several of its crew. The terrain was working against them. Sandy soil gave no traction. Underbrush masked enemy positions. And worst of all, parts of the area were flooded. Knee-deep swamp water that made it almost impossible to maneuver or evacuate the wounded. As the hours dragged on, casualties mounted. Medics worked under fire, dragging injured soldiers back through muddy fields, treating gunshot wounds and burns behind thin trees and APCs. Several acts of bravery went unrecorded, soldiers exposing themselves to pull wounded mates out of the line of fire. The Viet Cong showed no sign of retreat. They fought hard, determined to make the Australians bleed for every foot of ground. At one point, a platoon commander attempted a direct assault on an enemy bunker line, but was forced to fall back after suffering more losses. Meanwhile, air support was finally cleared. Royal Australian Air Force and U.S. aircraft roared overhead, dropping bombs and firing rockets into suspected enemy positions. The jungle exploded with napalm and high explosives. Still, the fighting didn't let up. The Viet Cong were deeply embedded, and many slipped away during the chaos, only to return minutes later to attack from new angles. By late afternoon, the Australians had pushed the enemy back from the central engagement area, but they hadn't broken them. Ammunition was running low. Wounded were still scattered across the battlefield. The smell of smoke, sweat, and cordite filled the air. Bodies, both Australian and Viet Cong, lay still in the mud and brush. Command faced a difficult choice: continue pressing forward into unknown terrain, possibly into another ambush, or withdraw and consolidate. They chose to pull back. Operation Bribie had become a brutal reminder that in Vietnam, even with superior training, artillery, and air support, the enemy always had the home advantage, and they knew exactly how to use it. As dusk approached on February 17th, the battlefield was smoldering, littered with wrecked vegetation, scattered gear, and the bodies of both Australian and Viet Cong soldiers. The objective to trap and destroy the enemy had failed. The Viet Cong had dug in, drawn the Australians into a brutal engagement, inflicted casualties, and then vanished into the jungle the moment momentum shifted. With darkness setting in and the risk of further ambushes rising, the order was given: withdraw and consolidate. But pulling out wasn't simple. Many of the wounded were still pinned down or stranded in exposed positions. Smoke still hung over the fields. Muddy ground and knee-deep swamps made stretcher movement agonizingly slow. Medics and infantry alike braved enemy fire to reach their mates, refusing to leave anyone behind. Some carried wounded men on their backs. Others crawled through muck, bullets snapping overhead, to reach downed comrades. The enemy harassed the withdrawal every step of the way. Sporadic sniper fire rang out from the tree line. Tracers occasionally cut through the twilight. The Australians laid down covering fire while artillery hammered likely escape routes, creating walls of shrapnel between the withdrawing troops and the jungle beyond. Aircraft buzzed low overhead, dropping flares to light up the terrain and deter follow-up attacks. Dust-off helicopters hovered in to extract the most seriously wounded, their rotors whipping smoke and debris into the air. Some armored vehicles had to be abandoned. One M113, hit earlier by RPG fire, sat smoldering as a grim reminder of how exposed even armor could be in Vietnam's unforgiving terrain. By nightfall, the Australian forces had pulled back, battered but intact. The dead had been recovered. The wounded were in the care of field medics. But morale was shaken. This hadn't gone to plan. The enemy hadn't broken. They'd stood and fought, then melted away on their own terms. The mission had been to destroy a retreating force. Instead, the Australians had walked into a well-laid ambush and been forced to fight their way back out. It was a hard lesson. In Vietnam, initiative could vanish in an instant, and survival often depended less on plans and more on grit. By the morning of February 18th, the scale of the previous day's battle had become painfully clear. 8 Australian soldiers were killed during Operation Bribie, one of the heaviest single-day losses for the Australian Army at that point in the Vietnam War. More than 24 others were wounded, many seriously. Among them were men burned inside armored vehicles, shot during attempted flanking maneuvers, or hit while carrying the wounded to safety. The enemy had taken losses too. Dozens of Viet Cong were confirmed dead, with trails of blood and drag marks suggesting many more had been carried away. But there was no sense of triumph among the Australians. The enemy had not been destroyed. They had chosen the time, place, and terms of the engagement. And when it was over, they slipped back into the jungle, as they had so many times before. Commanders began asking hard questions. Why hadn't intelligence picked up the enemy's prepared bunkers? Why was the terrain so poorly understood? Why were soldiers sent into swampy, uneven ground where vehicles bogged down and movement became nearly impossible? Officially, the operation was declared a tactical success. Enemy forces had been engaged and suffered casualties. But among the troops, there was little feeling of victory. Many considered it a near disaster, a mission that had nearly gone entirely wrong, saved only by the grit and determination of soldiers on the ground and the overwhelming firepower of artillery and air support. In Australia, media coverage was cautious. The casualty count could not be ignored, but the narrative was controlled. Reports emphasized the bravery of the troops and the success of the operation, but the grim details rarely reached the public in full. For those who fought at Bribie, the aftermath was personal. They remembered the heat, the smoke, the sudden burst of gunfire, the cries for medics, and the weight of carrying wounded friends through the mud. It was a reminder that no mission in Vietnam was ever simple, and that underestimating the enemy, even for a moment, could turn a clean plan into a bloody, chaotic fight for survival. Operation Bribie left more than physical scars. It shook the confidence of commanders, exposed cracks in planning and intelligence, and forced a rethink of how Australian forces operated in Vietnam. Tactically, Bribie became a case study in what not to do. The decision to insert troops near Ap Mian was based on outdated assumptions, that the enemy was on the move, not entrenched. There had been no thorough reconnaissance of the area, no confirmed intelligence on defensive positions, and no clear understanding of the terrain, which turned out to be a nightmare. Dry sand that bogged vehicles, cane fields that concealed bunkers, and swampy patches that trapped men during the fight. The Viet Cong had turned that terrain into a weapon. They had learned how to fight the Australians, drawing them in, pinning them down, and bleeding them before disappearing. After Bribie, Australian doctrine began to shift. No longer would units launch large-scale sweeps into unfamiliar areas without better intelligence. Greater emphasis was placed on deliberate reconnaissance, patrolling, and small unit operations. tactics that had served the Australians well in earlier campaigns like Malaya. Commanders also saw the limits of armored support. The M113 APCs were valuable in open ground, but in swamp and cane fields they were vulnerable and easily immobilized. New coordination procedures were introduced for infantry and armor to avoid repeat losses like those at Bribie. Politically, the operation came at a sensitive time. Public support for the war was already weakening in Australia. News of the casualties, especially the deaths of 8 soldiers in a single day, hit hard back home. While official statements emphasized enemy losses and successes, families and veterans knew the truth. This had been a fight for survival, not a clean victory. Questions were raised in Parliament. Some politicians began to press harder on the broader cost of the war, not just in dollars but in blood. Bribie became a quiet turning point. It didn't make headlines like Long Ton, but inside the Australian military, it changed how commanders viewed the battlefield. And inside the homes of those who lost sons, brothers, and fathers, it reinforced a bitter reality. Vietnam wasn't a quick campaign. It was a grinding war with no safe plans, only hard lessons. Operation Bribie never became a household name. It didn't inspire books, documentaries, or political speeches. It was buried beneath louder battles and more dramatic headlines. But for the soldiers who were there, it never faded. For many veterans, Bribie represented the harshest kind of lesson, that courage and discipline weren't always enough, that even the best trained forces could be caught off guard, especially in a war where the enemy wrote the rules, and the jungle obeyed no command. The men who fought that day showed exceptional bravery under fire. Medics who ran through open ground to reach the wounded, troops who held their positions in the face of withering fire, commanders who made life or death decisions while surrounded and outgunned. Their efforts prevented a disaster from becoming something far worse. Over time, Operation Bribie came to be studied not just for what went wrong, but for what was learned. The experience directly shaped how the Australian Army adapted its tactics for the remainder of the Vietnam War. Patrol doctrine evolved. Coordination between infantry, armor, and air support improved. Quick, reaction-based operations gave way to deeper planning and preparation. Today, the battle is remembered within the ranks of the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, as a defining moment in their Vietnam experience. Annual remembrances, regimental histories, and veteran gatherings keep the memory alive. Not in celebration, but in solemn recognition. Bribie didn't end with medals or victory parades. It ended in exhaustion, silence, and the long journey back to base. But in its aftermath, it left something more lasting than headlines. A hardened understanding of what the Vietnam War truly was. It was unforgiving, unpredictable, and deeply personal. Operation Bribie wasn't a triumph, but it was a turning point. It exposed the dangers of underestimating the enemy, of acting on flawed intelligence, and of believing that superior firepower alone could win the day. But it also revealed something deeper, the raw grit of Australian soldiers. Men who fought through chaos, carried their wounded under fire, and refused to leave anyone behind. In a war full of forgotten moments, Bribie stands as a quiet monument to resilience and to the steep cost of every inch gained in Vietnam. If you found this story powerful, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Over 90% of our viewers aren't subscribed yet, and it helps us keep telling the stories that history books too often skip over. Let us know in the comments. Had you ever heard of Operation Bribie before? And which Vietnam War battle should we cover next? Bin Ba, Coral Balmoral, or the Tet Offensive from the Anzac perspective? Thanks for watching, and to the veterans of Bribie, we remember your sacrifice. Late January 1968, just days before the Vietnamese Lunar New Year. Deep in the jungle northeast of Saigon, Australian soldiers were patrolling unfamiliar ground. The terrain was thick, broken, and hostile, but not quiet. There were signs everywhere. Fresh tracks, recently abandoned camps, unused ammunition stacked beside foxholes. Something was coming, and then it did. The first shot shattered the stillness. Automatic fire tore through the trees, mortars thumped in the distance. One patrol was hit, then another. Fire support bases Anderson and Harrison came under attack. But this wasn't just a local skirmish. It was the opening wave of one of the most explosive campaigns of the entire Vietnam War. The Tet Offensive had begun, and while the world's attention shifted to the battle for Saigon, Australian troops found themselves in the path of a major enemy thrust aimed at U.S. command and logistics hubs. The Australians weren't just holding the line, they were fighting to plug a critical gap in the Allied defenses. Operation Coburg was never meant to be history-making, but as Viet Cong forces surged across the country, the men of the 1st Australian Task Force stood in their way cut off, heavily outnumbered and under fire from all sides. This is the story of how Australian troops helped stop the Tet Offensive from turning into a total collapse, and why almost no one talks about it. By early 1968, the Vietnam War was about to change. The United States had poured hundreds of thousands of troops into South Vietnam. Major bases like Bien Hoa Air Base and the massive Long Binh logistics hub just north of Saigon had become essential to the war effort. They housed aircraft, artillery, command infrastructure, fuel depots, and tens of thousands of American and ARVN personnel. But intelligence reports were troubling. There were whispers of large enemy formations massing outside Saigon. Intercepts suggested that North Vietnamese and Viet Cong units were moving into position along jungle trails and hidden supply routes. Their target wasn't clear, but the threat was growing by the day. The Americans called for help. In a rare move, the Australian government authorized the 1st Australian Task Force, 1st ATF, to operate outside its usual area in Phuoc Tuy Province. It was the first time in the war that Australian forces would deploy to protect an American sector. The mission was codenamed Operation Coburg. Their orders: establish fire support bases northeast of Bien Hoa, conduct deep jungle patrols, ambush enemy forces, and deny the Viet Cong access to key approach routes into Saigon's northern flank. It was a risky deployment. The area was unfamiliar, heavily forested, and known to be crawling with VC. But the Australians accepted the mission and moved quickly. Fire support bases Anderson and Harrison were constructed under pressure, and within days, Australian patrols were in contact with enemy forces. What no one knew, not yet, was that the North Vietnamese were about to launch a massive, coordinated assault across all of South Vietnam. And Operation Coburg would place Australian troops directly in the path of one of its deadliest thrusts. While the world would remember the Tet Offensive for what happened in Hue and Saigon, it was in these jungles, far from the TV cameras, that the Australians would face some of their hardest, most critical fighting of the war. And they would do it quietly, outnumbered, outgunned, but not outmatched. On January 24, 1968, elements of the 1st Australian Task Force moved out of Phuoc Tuy Province and into the dense jungle northeast of Bien Hoa, deep inside enemy territory. It was unfamiliar ground. The Australians had spent nearly 2 years fighting Viet Cong guerrillas in their own province. But this was something else entirely. The terrain in the Coburg area of operations was tougher, wetter, and riddled with canal systems, tracks, and concealed enemy positions. It was classic Viet Cong country, and they knew it far better than the Australians did. Within days, the Australians established Fire Support Base Anderson, followed shortly by FSB Harrison. These hastily constructed bases would become the backbone of Operation Coburg. Artillery guns were dug in. Concertina wire was strung around makeshift perimeters. Observation posts were placed, and patrols began. Immediately, the signs were clear the enemy was already there. Fresh boot prints, recently used bunkers, abandoned cooking fires, small arms fire in the distance. It wasn't just an active area, it was a staging ground. Unbeknownst to the Australians, they were now operating right in the middle of a key North Vietnamese approach corridor into Long Binh and Bien Hoa. A corridor the NVA had no intention of giving up without a fight. Every patrol sent out from the fire bases found something. Signs of movement, VC runners, snipers, or direct contact. Ambushes became routine. By the 3rd day, Australian soldiers were already taking fire from multiple directions. And yet, there was no full-scale battle. Not yet. The jungle was holding its breath. Then came the intel reports, intercepts, sudden radio traffic, suspicious quiet in enemy-held zones. Something was building, something massive. What the Australians didn't know, but were about to find out, was that they were standing in the path of the largest communist offensive of the entire war. And when it came, there would be no warning. By the final days of January, the jungle around Fire Support Base Anderson was alive with tension. Every patrol from the 1st Australian Task Force reported signs of enemy movement. Not just small units or guerrilla groups, but large organized forces moving along concealed tracks. Some patrols discovered freshly dug bunkers and ammunition caches. Others stumbled across recently vacated campfires still smoldering. The Viet Cong were close. Too close. Then the shooting started. The first major contact came when a platoon-sized patrol encountered a heavily armed VC force near a canal line east of FSB Anderson. The Australians walked into a deliberate ambush. RPGs exploded from the tree line, machine guns opened up in short, accurate bursts, and enemy snipers fired from concealed positions. The patrol returned fire immediately, using suppressive bursts and calling in artillery support from Anderson. It was a sharp, vicious engagement, and it wouldn't be the last. Throughout the following days, contacts became more frequent and more intense. Enemy forces showed a level of coordination not normally seen in smaller skirmishes. There were signs the Viet Cong were probing the fire bases, testing their defenses, measuring the response time of Australian artillery and air support. The Australians adapted fast. Patrols were reinforced with armored personnel carriers. Artillery fire was pre-planned and coordinated with movement. Sniper teams were deployed to cover vulnerable approach routes. The dense jungle was becoming a chessboard, and the Australians were determined not to be outplayed. But there was something deeper, more ominous behind it all. The enemy wasn't just defending terrain, they were preparing for something. The constant engagements weren't just harassment, they were cover, diversions, distractions. And intelligence reports filtering in from US and ARVN sources hinted at something massive moving behind enemy lines. Back at Anderson, radio operators picked up strange traffic. Forward observers reported increased movement at night. Tunnels were found, abandoned in haste. Something was about to break, and it would break on the night of January 30th, with an explosion of violence that would stretch from Saigon to Hue and right through the Australian perimeter at Coburg. The Tet Offensive had begun. By the final days of January, the jungle around Fire Support Base Anderson was alive with tension. Every patrol from the 1st Australian Task Force reported signs of enemy movement. Not just small units or guerrilla groups, but large organized forces moving along concealed tracks. Some patrols discovered freshly dug bunkers and ammunition caches. Others stumbled across recently vacated campfires still smoldering. The Viet Cong were close. Too close. Then the shooting started. The first major contact came when a platoon-sized patrol encountered a heavily armed VC force near a canal line east of FSB Anderson. The Australians walked into a deliberate ambush. RPGs exploded from the tree line. Machine guns opened up in short, accurate bursts, and enemy snipers fired from concealed positions. The patrol returned fire immediately, using suppressive bursts and calling in artillery support from Anderson. It was a sharp, vicious engagement, and it wouldn't be the last. Throughout the following days, contacts became more frequent and more intense. Enemy forces showed a level of coordination not normally seen in smaller skirmishes. There were signs the Viet Cong were probing the fire bases, testing their defenses, measuring the response time of Australian artillery and air support. The Australians adapted fast. Patrols were reinforced with armored personnel carriers. Artillery fire was pre-planned and coordinated with movement. Sniper teams were deployed to cover vulnerable approach routes. The dense jungle was becoming a chessboard, and the Australians were determined not to be outplayed. But there was something deeper, more ominous behind it all. The enemy wasn't just defending terrain, they were preparing for something. The constant engagements weren't just harassment, they were cover, diversions, distractions, and intelligence reports filtering in from US and ARVN sources hinted at something massive moving behind enemy lines. Back at Anderson, radio operators picked up strange traffic. Forward observers reported increased movement at night. Tunnels were found, abandoned in haste. Something was about to break, and it would break on the night of January 30th, with an explosion of violence that would stretch from Saigon to Hue and right through the Australian perimeter at Coburg. The Tet Offensive had begun. At 3 a.m. on January 30th, the night sky lit up with flashes and thunderclaps of incoming fire. Across South Vietnam, communist forces launched a massive, coordinated assault that would come to define the war, the Tet Offensive. More than 80,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army troops struck over 100 towns and cities simultaneously, including Saigon, Hue, Da Nang, and crucially, Bien Hoa and Long Binh, the very installations Operation Coburg had been tasked to protect. At Fire Support Base Anderson, the Australians were already on edge from days of contact. When the mortars started falling, they were ready. Enemy rounds landed inside the perimeter. The base shook under the impact. Shrapnel tore through sandbags, vehicles, and dugouts. Australian gunners scrambled to man their 105mm artillery, returning fire in all directions. Troops ran to their posts, some still pulling on their boots. The base had been partially hardened, but not enough to prevent damage, and the enemy wasn't done. While rocket attacks slammed Anderson and nearby FSB Harrison, enemy infantry probed the wire, looking for weaknesses. These weren't random attacks. They were coordinated attempts to breach the fire bases and open corridors for Viet Cong units pushing toward Long Binh and Bien Hoa. But the Australians held. Patrols were pushed out to intercept. Infantry sections engaged in running battles through jungle clearings and along canal lines. One contact saw an entire VC assault squad wiped out by a coordinated infantry APC ambush just kilometers from the base. In another, a team of sappers was intercepted trying to emplace mines along a track used by U.S. supply convoys. The stakes were enormous. If the enemy broke through the Australian screen, they would have a direct route into Long Binh, home to thousands of U.S. troops, fuel depots, and one of the largest logistics centers in Southeast Asia. Despite being outnumbered, the Australians used superior training, jungle fighting experience, and relentless artillery support to keep the enemy at bay. Every engagement delayed, diverted, or disrupted VC operations. Coordination was key. Australian artillery batteries fired thousands of rounds in support of U.S. and ARVN units under siege elsewhere. Helicopter gunships flew low over the jungle, laying down rockets and minigun fire to halt enemy columns. And still, the Australians pushed further into enemy territory, hunting down VC formations that were trying to regroup after failed Tet attacks. The men of 1AT weren't holding the capital or defending television stations, but they were holding something just as vital, the enemy's front door. For over a week, they fought under constant threat. Fire bases were mortared almost nightly. Patrols left every morning not knowing if they'd return. Yet morale held. Discipline held, and the line held. In the chaos of Tet, while cities burned and headlines screamed of collapse, the Australians in Operation Coburg stood firm. And because they did, the enemy never reached their full objective. Throughout the first week of the Tet Offensive, fire support bases Anderson and Harrison became prime targets. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong understood that these positions were more than artillery outposts. They were shields. As long as the Australians held them, enemy forces couldn't push toward Bien Hoa or Long Binh without being seen, shelled, or stopped outright. So they hit them hard. Night after night, enemy mortar teams opened fire from the jungle. Some rounds hit their mark, blowing apart defensive wire, damaging bunkers, and injuring men caught in the open. The soldiers quickly adapted, reinforcing fighting positions, setting up counter-mortar patrols, and hardening perimeters with extra sandbags, claymores, and trip flares. Every man on base, infantry, engineers, artillery, signalers, had a job to do, and every one of them knew the enemy was watching. The artillery crews worked around the clock, responding to fire missions in support of both Australian patrols and U.S. and ARVN forces engaged elsewhere in the Tet battles. Some days saw thousands of rounds fired. Every shell sent downrange disrupted enemy columns, hit supply routes, or broke up attacks before they reached populated areas. Casualties mounted, but morale remained unshaken. Medical teams treated shrapnel wounds and concussion injuries in makeshift field hospitals. Mechanics worked under fire to keep vehicles running. Signal teams coordinated with American gunships and Allied ground units. It was a full-spectrum defense, a team effort under extreme pressure. Then came the closest call. One night, enemy sappers attempted to breach FSB Harrison's wire under the cover of mortar fire. Armed with satchel charges and grenades, they slipped through gaps in the jungle and crawled toward the base. But they were spotted. Flares lit the perimeter. Machine guns opened up, and the sappers were cut down just meters from the edge. The fire base is held, not by chance, but by grit, coordination, and a refusal to yield. The enemy had hoped to knock the Australians out early in Tet. Instead, they found two fortified bastions that refused to break. By mid-February 1968, the Tet Offensive had begun to lose momentum. Across South Vietnam, Allied forces were pushing back. In Saigon, U.S. and ARVN troops had retaken major government buildings. In Hue, brutal house-to-house fighting was slowly turning in the Allies' favor. And in the jungles northeast of Bien Hoa, the Australians of Operation Coburg had done their part, and more. The enemy had been denied access to vital routes. Repeated attempts to push through to Long Binh and Bien Hoa had been intercepted, repelled, or shattered before they could gain ground. The fire bases had held. Patrols had remained aggressive, and the enemy's window of surprise had been slammed shut. With the immediate threat fading, 1 ATF began withdrawing from the Coburg area in early March. Fire support bases Anderson and Harrison were dismantled. Artillery units packed up. Infantry companies loaded into APCs and helicopters. What was left behind was a devastated landscape. Cratered jungle, destroyed bunkers, spent shell casings, and the quiet knowledge of a job completed under fire. The cost had been real. 10 Australian soldiers were killed during Operation Coburg. 52 more were wounded. The confirmed enemy dead numbered over 145, with many more believed to have been killed or wounded in unrecorded engagements deep in the jungle. But beyond the numbers, Coburg had proven something vital, that Australian troops could deploy fast, hold ground, and disrupt major enemy movements on a scale far larger than their numbers suggested. They had protected key American positions when it mattered most, and they had done it while the rest of the world focused on Saigon's burning embassies and televised chaos. The battle for Coburg was over, but its impact would echo far beyond the jungle. Operation Coburg never made the front pages. While the world watched dramatic footage from Saigon and Hue, Australian troops were fighting and winning in a dense, silent corner of the war, far from the cameras and headlines. There were no urban ruins, no embassy sieges, no political theater. Just disciplined soldiers holding a jungle line under fire, keeping pressure on the enemy when the entire front was threatening to collapse. Today, Coburg is recognized by military historians as a critical, if understated, component of the Tet Offensive response. Without the 1st Australian Task Force holding the northeast approaches, the Viet Cong might have broken through to Long Binh, the logistical lifeline of the U.S. military in South Vietnam. If that had happened, the chaos of Tet could have spiraled into an even greater disaster. For the soldiers who fought there, Coburg became one of the defining campaigns of their Vietnam service. It showcased everything the Australian Army had built since arriving in country: rapid mobility, jungle warfare skill, discipline under pressure, and seamless integration of artillery and infantry. And while it was one of the few times Australia committed troops outside its assigned province, it proved they could operate in any zone, alongside any Allied force, and deliver results that mattered. Coburg never sought recognition. It was a quiet operation in the shadow of louder battles. But for those who were there, and for those who study what could have happened if they hadn't been, it remains one of the most successful and strategically vital missions of Australia's Vietnam War. Operation Coburg was never meant to be remembered. It was a support mission, a quiet deployment into a patch of jungle no one could find on a map. But when the Tet Offensive exploded across Vietnam, the men of the 1st Australian Task Force were already in position, and they held that position against artillery, against ambushes, against the odds. They weren't in the capital. They weren't on the evening news, but they were exactly where they needed to be, and they made sure the enemy didn't get any further. These are the stories that often get lost in the shadow of history, not because they're less important, but because they were fought by soldiers who didn't ask for recognition. They just did their job, and they did it with quiet courage. If you found this video valuable, consider leaving a like, sharing it with someone who respects military history, and subscribing to the channel. It helps us bring forgotten battles like this back to light, and to the veterans of Operation Coburg and the families who carry their memory, thank you. And to you, the viewer, thanks for watching. The sun hadn't broken through the canopy for hours. August 6, 1967, deep in the Vietnamese jungle, a company of the 7th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment was pushing through dense terrain near Suoi, Chau. It was supposed to be just another patrol, part of a wider clearing operation, but something felt off. The ground was freshly disturbed. Jungle paths looked too clean. The silence wasn't natural. The men tightened their spacing. Weapons were raised. Every step was heavier than the last. And then it hit. A deafening burst of gunfire erupted from both flanks. Machine guns raked the trees. RPGs slammed into the undergrowth, and grenades exploded in bursts of smoke and dirt. The Australians had stumbled into a perfectly prepared Viet Cong ambush, and they were outnumbered. Pinned down and bleeding, they returned fire, inching behind tree roots and termite mounds. Radio calls screamed for artillery support. Medics crawled under fire. One section fought off an entire assault with bayonets and grenades. This wasn't a battle, it was survival. Within minutes, the jungle was a war zone. This is the story of Suoi, Chau, where Australian soldiers were forced to fight for their lives in one of the most intense close-quarter engagements of the entire Vietnam War. And almost nobody talks about it. By mid-1967, Australian forces in Vietnam had settled into a deadly rhythm. Patrol, ambush, clear, repeat. The 1st Australian Task Force, 1 ATF, based at Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy Province, was tasked with keeping the region clear of Viet Cong forces, particularly the elusive but dangerous D445 Battalion, a local VC unit known for its hit-and-run tactics, deep jungle knowledge, and near-mythical ability to disappear into the bush. At this point in the war, Australia had refined its approach to counterinsurgency. Large-scale operations were supported by constant patrolling aimed at cutting off enemy movement, locating base camps, and ambushing supply routes. It was dangerous, exhausting work, but it was working. In early August, 7RAR launched Operation Ballarat, a wide-ranging search and destroy mission in the area northwest of Nui Dat, near the Suoi Chau Pha stream. Intelligence had hinted at enemy activity, recent sightings, trails, and possible resupply efforts, but nothing suggested what was waiting in the jungle. The goal was simple: send companies out to sweep the region, disrupt enemy movements, and clear any VC concentrations that might be preparing attacks or reinforcing positions. A company under the command of Major Ewart O'Donnell was tasked with patrolling one of the most difficult and remote sections. It was rough ground, overgrown, shadowed, and ideal for concealment, the kind of terrain where an ambush could happen in an instant and without warning. And that's exactly what would unfold. The Viet Cong weren't running. They weren't hiding. They were waiting. Unknown to the Australians, a significant force from D445 Battalion had dug in near Suoi, Chau Pha. They were well-armed, disciplined, and prepared to fight. The Australians would be walking into the kind of battle they trained for, but hoped they'd never have to face. Operation Ballarat was about to turn into a desperate fight for survival, one that would test 7RAR's courage, tactics, and endurance like never before. August 6, 1967. A company, 7RAR, moved out early under overcast skies. The monsoon humidity clung to everything: weapons, boots, even skin. The men were already soaked with sweat before they'd gone a kilometer. Their mission was routine by Vietnam standards: patrol the Suoi Chau Pha area as part of Operation Ballarat, searching for enemy bunkers and signs of Viet Cong movement. But there was nothing routine about the terrain. The jungle was thick, tangled, and almost deliberately disorienting. Visibility was reduced to a few meters in any direction. Communication between sections had to be tight. Every sound, a snapped twig, a bird suddenly going silent, made nerves tighten. Leading the patrol was 2 platoon, followed by 3 and 1 platoon in depth, spread out for flexibility. Their movement was careful, deliberate. The soldiers scanned every shadow, every suspicious shape. They had no illusions. This was dangerous country, and D445 Battalion had operated here before. Then came the first signs: a broken branch, a disturbed patch of ground, an oddly quiet pocket of jungle that felt wrong. The scouts picked it up first, small details that pointed to something recent, something nearby. Still they pushed forward. As they approached a slight rise near the Suoi Chau stream, the undergrowth thickened. The men slowed their pace. The ground felt too open, the terrain too perfect for concealment. They were now deep in unfamiliar territory, beyond quick support range, relying solely on each other, radios, and the hope that artillery could reach them if needed. And then, it happened. The lead element walked straight into a hornet's nest. Automatic fire exploded from the flanks. RPGs shrieked overhead. Grenades rained down from hidden positions. In seconds, the patrol was pinned, fragmented, and bleeding. The Viet Cong hadn't just laid an ambush, they had built a battlefield. The jungle detonated. What began as a few bursts of gunfire erupted into a full-scale ambush. From tree lines and bunkers the Australians hadn't seen, the Viet Cong's D445 Battalion opened up with a torrent of AK-47 fire, RPGs, machine guns, and grenades. The lead platoon was hammered immediately. Soldiers dropped to the ground, returning fire wherever they could. Some barely had time to hit the dirt before bullets whipped over their heads. The noise was deafening, a brutal combination of gunfire, shouting, explosions, and radios crackling as calls for support screamed through. Major O'Donnell, a company's commander, moved quickly. Orders were barked over the radio. His men were trained, battle-hardened, and now completely pinned. The VC weren't retreating like they often did. This was different. This was coordinated. They were well dug in and firing from prepared fighting pits. Multiple positions opened up at once, attacking from multiple directions. It was a textbook L-shaped ambush, and the Australians had walked straight into it. Amid the chaos, medics crawled under fire to reach the wounded. Some soldiers fired blind through the jungle just to keep heads down. One group returned grenades as fast as they landed. Machine gunners, finding what cover they could, laid down suppressive fire so wounded men could crawl back behind tree roots and bomb craters. The vegetation became a death trap. Smoke mixed with the humidity and blocked vision. Radios crackled with broken transmissions as platoons tried to regroup under fire. Close artillery support was requested. Danger close. RAA, Royal Australian Artillery, batteries from Nui Dot and FSB Horseshoe responded immediately, firing coordinated salvos. Shells tore through the jungle canopy, smashing enemy bunkers and scattering VC fighters. But it was still not enough to break the assault. The enemy was committed. They surged again. VC fighters launched another push toward the Australians' flanks. This time, 3 platoon met them with blistering fire and grenades. The Australians were holding, but just barely. Ammunition was running low. Casualties were mounting. The heat was oppressive, and there was no real cover. Only mud, trees, and determination. At one point, enemy fighters tried to infiltrate the rear of A Company's position, circling through the trees. But they were spotted and cut down by a pair of Australians manning a light machine gun with near-perfect timing. In the middle of it all, the Australians showed discipline under pressure. Fire was controlled. Orders were followed. Wounded men refused to be evacuated until others were safe. One soldier reportedly held off an enemy element single-handedly with a rifle, a bayonet, and sheer refusal to give ground. As hours dragged on, the Australian position remained intact, battered but unbroken. The enemy had thrown waves of force at them and failed to collapse their defense. The jungle had become a cauldron, but the line held. Eventually, under the weight of artillery, aggressive counterfire, and mounting casualties, the VC began to withdraw. Like ghosts, they melted back into the trees, fast, silent, and dragging their dead and wounded with them. They'd ambushed the Australians with overwhelming force, and still they hadn't broken them. As the smoke drifted through the trees and the air filled with the metallic sting of gunpowder, the Australians dug in. The enemy wasn't finished. After the initial ambush, the Viet Cong regrouped and tried again, striking hard at the flanks, searching for a break in the Australian perimeter. But the men of 7 RAR were ready now. They knew the terrain, they knew their arcs of fire, and they'd already bled too much to give up an inch. Radio traffic between forward elements and company HQ painted a grim picture. Casualty reports were mounting. Ammunition was running low in some platoons. Multiple soldiers were critically wounded, and medevacs were being requested urgently. But the jungle was too hot. Choppers couldn't safely land until the area was secured. Still, the Australians held. Major O'Donnell coordinated defensive sectors and ordered additional artillery missions. Again, danger close. Rounds from 105mm howitzers came crashing down just meters from their position, walking a wall of fire through enemy approach lines. It was risky, but it worked. It bought precious time. Section leaders repositioned their men to cover new angles. Fire teams rotated barrels on machine guns to keep them from jamming. Some wounded soldiers refused to fall back, instead propping themselves against trees. Others volunteered to carry extra ammunition forward, even under heavy contact. And through it all, there was no panic, just sharp, brutal professionalism. Then came the turning point. The Viet Cong launched one final push, a concerted effort to break the Australian lines. But they ran straight into 3 platoon, reinforced and dug in. The Australians unleashed everything: rifles, machine guns, M79 grenade launchers, and it tore through the advancing force. When that assault broke, so did the enemy's momentum. By now, artillery fire was relentless, smashing suspected VC fallback positions. Helicopter gunships arrived overhead, firing rockets into escape routes. What had started as an ambush was now turning into an Australian counteroffensive. As enemy fire tapered off, medevac choppers finally got the green light. Pilots flew in low, under threat, to extract the wounded. Smoke grenades marked landing zones carved into jungle clearings. Medics loaded stretchers fast, knowing the enemy could return at any moment. By late afternoon, it was clear the Australians had not just survived. They'd won. They had faced a numerically superior, well-prepared force and held the line under some of the worst combat conditions of the entire war. It wasn't clean, it wasn't perfect, but it was enough. And for the men of A Company, that was all that mattered. By late afternoon, the jungle finally fell silent. What had been a kill zone just hours earlier was now a battlefield strewn with the wreckage of close combat, twisted foliage, expended magazines, empty shell casings, and the harsh reality of casualties. The Viet Cong had broken contact, retreating into the dense jungle with their wounded and dead, using hidden trails and spider holes to vanish almost as quickly as they had appeared. The Australians, bloodied and exhausted, began to assess what was left. 5 Australians had been killed. More than 20 were wounded, several critically. Among them were soldiers he hit in the first moments of the ambush, medics injured while trying to save others, and men who had fought on despite taking shrapnel and gunfire. Some wounded had walked out on their own. Others had to be stretchered through jungle and mud under constant threat of renewed contact. The battlefield was slowly secured. A perimeter was reestablished. Patrols swept the area to confirm the enemy had truly withdrawn. What they found was staggering. Numerous enemy dead, some still in their bunkers, others scattered along the approach routes. Blood trails marked the paths of those who had been dragged away. In the confusion, intelligence teams gathered what they could: documents, weapons, maps, anything left behind in the VC's hasty retreat. It became clear that the Australians had engaged a large element of D445 Battalion, likely reinforced for a planned future attack. Instead, they'd been caught early and decisively disrupted. The Royal Australian Artillery's precision had played a major role. So had the calm leadership under fire and the discipline of infantrymen who had trained for exactly this kind of scenario. But it had come at a cost. As helicopters lifted out the last of the wounded, those who remained began to dig in for the night. Even in victory, no one let their guard down. In Vietnam, silence didn't mean safety. Not yet. The Battle of Suoi Chau had ended, but for those on the ground, its echoes would linger long after the last gunshot faded. The next morning, as the sun broke over the jungle canopy, a company faced the grim task of moving forward. The Battle of Suoi Chau had lasted only hours, but it left a deep scar. The ground was churned by explosions and stained with blood. Craters marked the jungle floor. Trees had been shredded by gunfire and artillery. The quiet was unsettling. Too quiet. Back at Nui Dat, the full weight of what had happened began to register. News of the engagement spread quickly through the ranks. 5 men had been killed, a devastating toll for a single contact. Many more were wounded, some severely. For 7 RAR, it was one of the costliest days of the war so far, but it was also one of the clearest examples of courage under fire. Questions naturally followed. Had the intelligence underestimated the enemy presence? Should the company have had closer support or heavier weapons? Was the patrol area too deep, too isolated? But there was also pride. Reports from the battlefield highlighted acts of incredible bravery. Soldiers who carried wounded mates through fire, machine gunners who held positions alone under attack, medics who worked while bleeding. Artillery crews had responded instantly and with terrifying accuracy. The company had held its ground and refused to be overrun, despite being ambushed by a numerically superior, dug-in enemy. In the days that followed, Operation Ballarat continued, but the focus shifted. Every patrol from that point forward operated with sharpened caution, scanning every rise and gully for signs of another ambush. The battle at Suoi had changed the way 7 RAR moved, fought, and thought about the war. At base, memorial services were held. Letters were written home. Equipment was cleaned in silence. The soldiers processed the battle in their own way, but none forgot what had happened that day in the jungle. It wasn't just another fight. It was a defining moment. The Battle of Suoi quickly became one of the most studied engagements in Australia's Vietnam War experience. It wasn't just the intensity of the fight, it was what the battle revealed. That in Vietnam, even the best-trained soldiers could find themselves in a life-or-death situation with zero warning. That the enemy was capable, cunning, and always watching. And that success would rely not just on firepower, but on leadership, coordination, and raw personal courage. For 7 RAR, the battle left a permanent mark. It showed the importance of inter-unit communication, forward artillery planning, and having rapid casualty evacuation procedures, all of which had been pushed to their limits that day. It also reinforced something every soldier already knew, but rarely said out loud, that the jungle was never really under control. You could sweep an area, patrol it, burn it, clear it, and the next day the enemy would be back. Suoi became a teaching point for Australian forces in country. Training was adjusted. Patrol formations were refined. Emphasis was placed on reacting under ambush conditions, not just initiating contact. The battle also confirmed what the Viet Cong already knew. Australian soldiers were not easy targets. For the men who fought there, the legacy was personal. The faces of those who didn't come home stayed with them. Some never spoke of the battle again. Others told their stories in pieces, in barracks, over beers, or years later at reunions. To historians, it remains a perfect example of what Vietnam really was. Brutal, fast, and unforgiving. A place where minutes felt like hours, and where every decision could mean the difference between survival and disaster. Suoi wasn't famous. It wasn't shown on the news. But for those who were there, it was unforgettable. The Battle of Suoi wasn't a headline war story. It wasn't fought in a city or broadcast on TV. There were no medals paraded in front of cameras, no front-page heroics. Just Australian soldiers, tired, outnumbered, deep in the jungle, who refused to give in. What they faced that day was brutal. What they did was extraordinary. They held the line. These are the kinds of stories history often overlooks, not because they lack importance, but because they were carried out quietly, with grit, discipline, and sacrifice. Suoi showed the worst of war and the best of those who fought it. If you value these kinds of untold chapters, the ones that don't make documentaries or textbooks, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Over 90% of our viewers aren't subscribed, and your support helps us bring stories like this back into the light. And to the veterans of the 7th Royal Australian Regiment and the families of those who never returned, we honor your service, your strength, and your sacrifice. Thanks for watching. The battles you've just seen were only a small part of Australia's war in Vietnam. Fought far from home, often in silence, and rarely remembered. For the men who were there, these weren't chapters in a history book. They were moments of survival, loss, and decisions made under impossible pressure. If stories like these matter to you, leave a like and subscribe for more in-depth military history. Your support helps keep these documentaries alive. Thank you for watching, and thank you for taking the time to remember the Forgotten Front.